What do you think is the most remote point in Alaska? Unsurprisingly, there are plenty to choose from, but determining the most remote point isn't as straightforward as you'd think. But first, let me know what you think is the most remote point on Earth. In my last video, I discussed the most remote point in the lower 48 as determined by distance to the nearest road. As it turns out, the farthest you can get from a road in the lower 48 is 21.6 miles at the Thoroughfare Ranger Station in Yellowstone National Park. But unsurprisingly, this pales in comparison to the most remote point in Alaska. You see, Alaska only has about 18,000 miles of public roads, despite covering an area of more than 660,000 square miles, which makes it a lot easier to get farther from the nearest road. In fact, there are large portions of the state that aren't even connected to any sort of road network. One look at a map, and it's easy to see that there are plenty of areas that are likely hundreds of miles from the nearest road. But unlike in the lower 48, Alaska hasn't been surveyed in detail to determine the most remote point as determined by distance from the farthest road specifically. Fortunately, a 2003 study from the University of Alaska Fairbanks explored some other metrics to determine the most remote point in the state. The most restrictive metric they used was distance from the nearest village, road, or trail, and using this metric, they found that the most remote points in mainland Alaska were generally focused on the far northwestern and northeastern parts of the state. But specifically, they found that the most remote point using this metric was a stretch of the Colleen River located in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge near the Canadian border, as it sits more than 85 miles from the nearest human feature. But it turns out that you can find an even more remote point if you remove seldom used winter trails from consideration and only consider the distance from the nearest village. In that case, the most remote point would shift to a bend in the Etivluk River on Alaska's north slope that is located more than 120 miles from the nearest settlement. And finally, if we're willing to leave the mainland and consider islands as well, then the most remote point in Alaska, and likely all of the United States, is St. Matthew Island, a small uninhabited island located in the Bering Sea, about 209 miles from the nearest human civilization. So what do you think should be considered the most remote point in Alaska? Let me know in the comments, and let me know which remote landscapes you'd like to see next.